Good evening, all. Tonight we are talking about phrenology and freedom. So, we're in the middle of the 17th and 18th century, and the big question that everyone asking is, can there be a science of the mind? That is to say, can we apply the principles of natural science, so biology, chemistry, physics, and the rest of it, to the mind itself? And the general answer they come up with is, well, yeah, we can. So Franz Joseph Gall comes along, and he is a neuroanatomist, and he's going to study the brain quite extensively. And while not immediately impactful, it comes up with some stuff that's going to be very useful for our purposes. So Gall invents the science of phrenology, which isn't much of a science at all, but that the brain structures are related to brain function is very important. So on the right, you see a phrenological bust, ostensibly number 6 in a series of I don't know how many. And those little grid marks on the head are supposed to tell for or against certain possibilities of behavior. So, as all of these guys are coming about, Hume, the philosophes, Kant, and the other Enlightenment thinkers, the scientific imagination of the period is very, very active. So, we've got writings like H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, the very beginnings of science fiction, and it's a cool time and excellent reading for us. So, Gassendi, if you recall, had kind of built on Democritus, and the anatomist said that everything in the world is reducible to an atomic corpuscular particulate form. Newton had come along and used the same corpuscularian ideas. Galileo, who looks like he just got it from a nap, is also going to have this reductionistic approach to complex problems. Locke says our mind is corpuscular. If you recall, it's kind of a cookie jar. When something is done by us or to us, we have an experience, we bake a cookie, and into the jar it goes, thus furnishing the mind. Descartes has a really radically biological proof where the mind interacts with the body in a fairly complex way. Except for those uniquely rational powers that Descartes says we have, everything else is entirely biological. So Descartes is going to give us this philosophical foundation for a really materialistic approach to the mind and mental life. Lamartine comes along and gives us Man the Machine, and this is a way of looking at the long debates problem of knowledge, conduct, and governance in a very mechanistic kind of way. By the end of the 18th century, so the 1700s, they're really getting back to being interested in scientific and medical circles. Along comes Lavater, and he's going to come up with physiognomy, which has nothing to do with the gnome down there. In this case, human facial characteristics correspond to certain social types, like artists, geniuses, and criminals. So these are some of Lavater's notes. Obviously, you can see they're probably hyperbolic at best and stereotypical at worst, but it is a step in the right direction. So Gall's going to come along and he wants to know, why are personalities so very different? He's born in Germany, studies at Strasbourg and the University of Vienna, and his first theory is that the larger your eyes you have, the larger your memory must be. Now, why would that be? Well, you're taking in more information, and therefore you must be capable of receiving more information. Now, this is not correct, and our friend Marty Feldman here did not necessarily have any better memory than anybody else, but it does get us started to think about physical features. Now, what we've got here is a sagittal transection of the brain, kind of showing the medial line. You've got the medulla oblongata tapering down into the pons, and so on and so forth. So, this is cranioscopy, literally looking inside the head. And what it holds is, if we look at cranial formations very carefully, we can start to understand some of the underlying mental and moral faculties held by that person. Now, this is problematic, though, because it doesn't take into account God, and so the clergy have him sanctioned for this uh, successfully around 1802 or so on. Now, phrenology, as we see down here, it's adapted from the phren, from the Greek, which just means mind. Okay? So Gall leaves Austria, makes his way through Germany, makes his way through France, and he's going to be brought up on charges of atheism. He's not elected to the French Academy, but along the way, he's still trying to prove his point, and so he writes quite a bit about the function of the brain. Now, later on, his system would be called bumpology and be kind of a parlor trick. But he does establish some pretty good evidence. He examined changes of brain in the mass of human fetuses naturally spontaneously aborted, so basically miscarriages, looking at different gestational markers and laying the foundations for human developmental neuroanatomy, how the brain develops. He makes similar observations in non human species. So he finds that comparative neuroanatomy is going to be important. That is to say, that the elephant, the human, the dolphin, the gorilla, the dog, the cat, the macaque, the mouse, and whatever all have very similar brains, or at least it looks that way. And the brain function is going to be determinative of something better. He also is going to study the cranial features of living celebrities, criminals, mental defectives, and insane people. These are death masks that you see here. So we have Napoleon, President McKinley, the Nazi war criminal Heydrich, Ned Kelly, the Australian bush outlaw, and the Russian novelist Dostoevsky. So, what is it about their heads and their facial structure that tells us about their minds? On the basis of all of this, Gall offers what he calls four incontestable truths. We're only interested in two of them. Let's take a look. First is this: every mental and moral faculty of the mind is associated with a specific organ. This is a functional unit of what today we would call a module in the brain, and they're kind of depicted on the right there. Second, the degree of a faculty that a person possesses is associated with the relative mass of brain connected to that faculty. So if you look kind of there on the middle left, you see the speech center. If your speech is very well developed, he would say that that's going to be a larger part of the brain than, say, something you're not as good at. Body awareness, maybe that's shrunk down. Who knows? Okay. Now, here we have another transection that kind of cuts through the eye, through the sinus, through the maxilla. And this is showing us all of these loops of the brain. And you notice where the brain pushes up, the skull pushes up also. So the conformation of the skull tells us about where different things in the brain are going to be pushing forward. It's going to be a little while before physiologists test Gall's theory, but this is going to become known as psychobiology or physiological psychology. Okay? Along come a couple of guys, Mashendi and Bichat, who do something we could never do today. But basically what they do is they destroy regions of the brain of unanesthetized animals and see what deficits are produced by the destruction of that area. So basically, it was mostly dogs. I apologize to dog lovers, but they would destroy a part of the brain that they assumed worked into balance. They would see if the dog retained its balance. If it did not, that was considered confirmation that they were correct. Now, along comes Pierre Florenz with his cool little Superman curl, and he is going to examine phrenology rather closely in a critical way. Florenz says Gall was right, but he was wrong. He was right in that certain areas of the brain do perform certain functions. He was just wrong as to which functions those areas of the brain were, and it didn't work along to that careful phrenological bust. So Gall puts on the map of scientific thought a problem that we're still interested in: how localized function works. So in that upper right-hand corner there, we see symbols. Now, if you're out driving and you see a red octagon with some sort of white lettering on it, you're going to associate that with a symbol. And that symbol is stop, or at least that's what's symbolized, and so on and so forth. Now, if we look at this for a little bit, if we look at the chart in the upper left, say the color, not the word. The right side of your brain wants to say the color, but the left side of your brain insists on reading the word. If we look down at the lower right, we try and figure out how many legs the elephant has, or we read the sentence that's beside it, we find similar contradictions and confusions. What Gall is really going to give to us is not phrenology. Phrenology is kind of a waste. But he's going to take philosophy of mind out of the speculative side of philosophy and put it firmly in the sciences in what's going to develop as psychology. The speculative approach that Locke had and Hume had isn't entirely replaced, but it's certainly complemented by the relationship between the psychic and the physical processes. This is Gall's major contribution, and it's one that's going to be very important to us as we move forward. All right, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about freedom. So, this is going to take place in Weimar and feature guys like Goethe, that's even though it looks like Goethe, it's Goethe, Schiller, and other thinkers. So, the Romantic Rebellion is kind of going to take place between the rationalists and the empiricists, and they're going to say that while Newton was important, his mechanistic philosophies were incomplete and a little bit misleading. This is not Johnny Depp, but they return to the book of nature, where they find mystery and transcendental powers, powers that are essentially aesthetic. So, aesthetic in general language means referring or to pleasing to the senses. This is grounded in freedom because, well, what we find pleasing is going to differ. In Goethe's Faust and in Schiller's Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, freedom is the very definition of our humanity. Romanticism is going to come along then and is going to ignite the human imagination in its fully philosophical expression. Romanticism is a reaction to and rejection of the Enlightenment, just as the Enlightenment was a reaction to and rejection of, do you remember? Scholasticism. So, the principal agenda of the Enlightenment was to challenge those traditional sources and modes of authority using this scientific worldview. So the Enlightenment sets itself up against the artificial contrivances of the scholastic philosophies, the authority of Scripture over revelation, the invented powers of rank and title, and the slothful acceptance of tradition and the alleged wisdom of bygone times. So Descartes' kind of one of the fathers of this modern worldview, but he helps to set the stage for the Enlightenment by starting out doubting all things. I doubt that anything exists. Wait, doubt is a kind of thinking. I seem to be the thing that thinks. Thinking proves my existence. I think, therefore I am. With Rousseau, we want to return to that religion of nature, something that really can't be described with the artificial and fallible instrument of our language. Kant is going to place an insuperable barrier, that means we can't climb over it, between the world of phenomena, sorry, and the noumenal reality behind that world. So, what we perceive may or may not be the actual object itself. What Kant's philosophy is saying is we need to get to the bottom of things to see what's behind the screen and to understand that there are formalisms that guide and edit our perceptions. We don't want to see certain things. But a perception isn't going to give us the real nature of things. And if science is based primarily on observation and perception, and we know that observation gives us only phenomenal and not noumenal realities, then all science, by definition, has built in limitations. Now we're starting to get this idea that freedom is really what makes us completely unique apart from all other things. Consider the appearance in the late 18th century of the Gothic novel, such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto. You're probably very familiar with Frankenstein from popular culture, but if you have not read the book, you absolutely need to do so. The Castle of Otranto is less well known, but it's one of the first semi-modern ghost stories and sort of this tale of macabre horror. The idea is that there's something just past the campfire light, something lurking out there in the darkness, and that's what makes it scary, which is really great. Likewise, William Blake and John Henry Fuseli come along. Fuseli writes an epic poem called Polyphemus, who was one of the, I don't know if we'd call him a villain, but one of the antagonists in the Odyssey. The blind monster, in this case, suggests to us that there are some truths inaccessible to the eye, and therefore inaccessible to the light of science. So on the left here, we have Polyphemus comforting one of his pets, his goat. On the right side there, we have the great red dragon and the woman who is clothed with the sun. This is not only an important piece of the movie Red Dragon, but this is a watercolor by William Blake. Now, this romantic rebellion gives this idea that there's some kind of mystery behind the reality that we should be looking for. It's not accessible to the eye until the eye can be liberated from the formalisms of things like religion, science, logic, and even philosophy itself. Goethe comes along and is very much the soul of Romanticism. He writes a book called Farbenlehre, which means like far seer, and it is an analysis of color vision. In this, he says Newton explains everything about light except what we see. There's really nothing in the physics of light that tells us how anything should appear to us. It tells us nothing, for instance, about the perception of beauty, which we put under aesthetics, why we like certain things and find them pleasing. Goethe and Schiller are very good friends. Goethe is going to write Faust during this time. Schiller will write the letters on the aesthetic education of man. And they're going to come to the conclusion that freedom creates and determinism limits and kills. If you are a great artist and you're told that you can only ever draw stick figures and smiley faces, you're going to be very limited. If you're a gifted chef and all you can ever make is grilled cheese and grits, that's going to really limit you. Schiller tells us, very importantly, we are never our authentic selves so much as when we are fully at play. Now, we need to play. This is not, I played Call of Duty till 3 in the morning. This is, I did something purely for the joy of the activity itself and not for anything external to that. This is Schiller's idea of the authenticity of this, doing something fun simply because it's fun. Now, in Faust, which I would encourage you to read, we've got a bored polymath, a guy who basically knows everything and finds no new knowledge that gives him any abiding pleasure. What sort of enticement would it take for Faust to give his soul to Mephistopheles and in return to receive a completely unique experience that he would never grow tired of? So the question, what would you sell your soul for, is at the bottom of this play. What's clear is that just knowing about the world doesn't necessarily make us at home in it. We can know all about the world in scientific terms and still feel kind of lonely. There's also lengths that we might go to achieve the transcendent, an experience of such quality and so sublime that we just want to stop and appreciate it. And it's our autonomy, our autonomos, our self-guidance, our self-law, our self-governance, our radical freedom that even allows us to enter into these bargains in the first place. So Faust Part 2, which Goethe wrote many, many years ago, is a little bit different. It's intriguing, though. He sees a free people engaged in the art of life. In other words, he looks beyond his own study and has that unique experience that he was seeking. Complete freedom, as it's available to us, is an authenticity that comes from what we freely choose autonomously to do. The German philosopher depicted there is Johann Fichte. He was one of Kant's contemporaries. And he says, how do we know when we are or have been truly free? When we meet with opposition. The first time someone tells us to stop whatever it is that we're doing, that's where our freedom is limited. So having gone through all of the different things that only the devil can present in the form of Mephistopheles, Faust has a completely unique experience, giving his lands over to the people who have toiled on them because he sees that he can. Romantic freedom ultimately is a selfless idea. It's an absorption into totality because we give up our private freedom for the freedom of others. So he gets redeemed in the story and gets to keep his soul. The idea of freedom that's really central to Kant and celebrated by Goethe, Schiller, and all the others of this German romantic idealist is an informing chapter in our problems of knowledge, of conduct, and of governance. What the aesthetes concluded is this: science, as Newton had set it up, was entirely too mechanical, reductive, and indifferent to the human condition, even when it considers the human condition. What they would put against this is the truth of nature against the fabrications of the natural philosopher, read scientist. This idea that there is creative power and genius, and there are transcendent sources of beauty and wonder. This is central to the Romantic worldview, this wonder that we alone as humans have. They would say that any philosopher who would explain the world only mechanistically, in the wake of Newton, has not really seen the world. And that's where we stop for today. Have a good evening. Bye bye.